Hi everyone! Today we're going to do a simple MoGraph animation using the Voronoi Fracture object and a plugin called the NOTA Effector. And what we're going to be doing is this. We're going to create these Tetris-shaped pieces and we have them animate to form a cube. So let's get started. First of all, we need a cube, and I'm going to fracture this cube using the MoGraph Voronoi Fracture object. And we're not going to colorize the fragments. And let's go ahead and delete the default source, which is a point generator. What I'm going to use for breaking up this object is a matrix object. I'm going to set this to 7 by 7 by 7, and I'm going to add it as a source in the Voronoi Fracture object. And you can see this is breaking up the cube into more or less evenly sized smaller cubes. And I'm going to scale the matrix object down just a little bit. Oh, I picked the wrong one. So let's scale the matrix object down, and you can see the size of the pieces it generates changes. So I'm going to scale it down so I can roughly create a grid of evenly sized cubes. In order to get the Tetris-shaped objects that you saw in the animation I showed you earlier, we need to use a feature of the Voronoi Fracture, which is called Geometry Glue. So if you go to this tab, you can enable Geometry Glue, and we're going to set the glue type to cluster. And by default, Cinema 4D takes a look at the clones that are created, or the fracture objects that are created, and it creates a cluster or a certain amount of clusters. So default is 5 pieces, and we also have a cluster seed. I'm going to set this to maybe 60, and if you want to, you can play around with the seed and choose whatever you like. So if I render this, you're not going to see anything, and I want these pieces to be separate pieces, and I want to be able to see that these are separate pieces. And in order to do that, I'm going to use a bevel deformer, which I can't use right now. First of all, we need to put the Voronoi Fracture object in a null object. So this is our Voronoi Fracture null, and the matrix is our fracture source. And we can hide this. And now I can select the Voronoi Fracture null object, hold down Shift, and add a bevel deformer. And let's use an angle. I don't want any subdivisions here. Let's go to the render settings. I'm going to switch on ambient occlusion, and I'll change the ray length to maybe 20. And I'm also going to change the color to something bluish, because I already know that I want to use a variation of blue colors on my cube here. I'm also going to add a floor object, and I'll move it down to about here, to the bottom of the cube. And I'm going to create a simple material, and I'll just switch off reflectance and color and use luminance, and I'll bring this down a little bit and put it on the floor. And now we have something like this. And let's go ahead and reduce the Phong angle to maybe 22. So that is looking a lot better. Now I want all of these pieces to have a different color, and personally I prefer to use a plugin called Kendo Shaders by Tools 4D, but you can do the same thing with the variation shader. So I'm going to create an additional material. I will call this Ninja Shader. And I can add this as a texture. So the Kendo shaders by Tools 4D comes as a package of 4 different shaders. I'm not even sure if they sell this plugin anymore, but it's still working in at least until release 19. And one of these shaders is the Ninja colors, and it's very similar to the variation shader. So I can add this in my texture slot here, and then I can, let me just put this onto my Voronoi Fracture object. And right now if I render this, nothing happens. It just shows the default color. But I can pick a color here in the Ninja shader, and I'm going to pick something bluish, something like this. And now I put it in the wrong texture channel. I'm just going to copy this and paste it here. So that's looking a lot better. Now we're getting something. So we have this base color, and I can change the hue here, and the more I change this, the more color variation I get. And usually I only use a very low setting for this. So I'm just getting a couple of different shades of the color that I picked here, and I can change the saturation, for example. So you have a couple of different settings. I'm not going to go into all of these. Saturation makes the colors more vibrant. I also have a blending mode here. I can set this to any value that I want, and it's going to blend this color based on this gradient down here. And you can change the seed and get a different distribution of the randomly assigned colors. Okay, so something like this looks nice, but like I said, you could also use the variation shader. So let's create another material and call this variation, and let's put this in the color channel. You can find it under Effects, Variation, and let's put that on the Voronoi Fracture object. And the variation shader will automatically add random colors to your objects. So let's go ahead and open the variation shader, and let's have a look at the settings. The first thing I'm going to change is the random color, and I'm going to set this to 0 because I want the pieces to be colored with shades of blue. And right now nothing is happening, it's just the default white. So I can set the blending mode to 100%, and it's going to blend and add colors based on this gradient here. And let's go ahead and click on this blue color. I'm going to change that to something like this maybe. Yeah, let's make this a little bit darker. And these are nice desaturated bluish colors. We can change the gradient mode to replace. You can see the colors get a lot more vibrant. So let's just say this is something that we want here. So now we have the basic setup for our animation. We've fractured the cube into the pieces that we want, and now we want to animate this. And for the animation, I'm going to use a plugin called the NOTA Effector, and it pretty much works like the effectors in Cinema 4D. If you have your MoGraph object selected and add the NOTA Effector, it will automatically be added to the Effectors tab. With the exception of the Mo Extrude and PolyFX deformers, I think. Even if you have these selected, the NOTA Effector will not be added automatically to the Effectors tab. But as for the rest of these MoGraph objects, the NOTA Effector works exactly like the Cinema 4D effectors. So let's go ahead and add the NOTA Effector. And immediately you can see something happen. And what the NOTA Effector does is it takes all of the clones and it puts them at the center of the Voronoi Fracture object. Now before we continue, I'd like to explain a few basic things about the NOTA Effector. This is not a complete introduction to the NOTA Effector, but I think I should explain a few things so at least you know how the basics work. So I'm just going to start a new scene file, and I'm going to add a matrix object. And I'll just change the grid to something like this, and I'm going to add the NOTA Effector to this. So like I said before, what the NOTA Effector does immediately, it takes all of the clones and puts them at the center of the object. Let's have a look at how the NOTA Effector works. If I hit play on the timeline, we get an animation immediately. So how does this animation work? And it's kind of important to understand that, to have control over the NOTA Effector. And the basic settings can be found on the Effector tab of the NOTA Effector. Now, what happens by default is that each clone is animated a certain amount of time. So each of the clones takes 25 frames to reach its final position. And we have a step here, and the step is the number of frames it takes for the next clone to start its animation. So once the first clone has started animating, it takes one more frame for the next clone to start the same animation, and the second clone will also take 25 frames to reach its final position. The offset is when the entire animation starts. So if I put this to 60 frames and hit play, nothing will happen until frame 60, and at frame 60 the clones will start animating. I'll just reduce the number of matrices here, and let's put them closer together. So let's say I want these to take 60 frames to animate on, and I'll just make the timeline a lot longer, maybe 300 frames, and I'll set the step size to 30 or 40. Let's do 30. So this means that each clone takes 60 frames to animate to its final position, and once the first clone has started animating, 30 frames after that, the next clone will start. So we're getting this very slow animation. You can see that each of the clones starts animating. I'm not sure if each of the subsequent clones again takes 30 frames before it starts animating, because it doesn't look like that, but at least it's for the first clone. So it doesn't start until frame 30, which is this step here. So maybe the step is calculated on something different, because this clone here should actually start at frame 90, I think. Let's go ahead and try that. Yeah, it does start a bit sooner than frame 90. So this does seem to be calculated a little bit differently, but I hope you get the general idea of this. I'm just going to put this back to 30. Let's do 10 steps and animate this. And I'm also going to set the matrix to maybe 2 on the y-axis and change that to something like this. So what's also important about the NOTA Effector is where the animation starts and how you can control in which order the clones are animated on. And you can do that with the NOTA Effector. By default, the start position is at the center of the object. What if I don't want that? Well, if I don't want that, there is an option that is called Start Reference, and you can drag in any object you want into this slot, or you can have the NOTA Effector generate a null object for you, which represents the start position of the animation. So if I take this null object and drag it back to about here, what happens is that the animation will start from that position. So you can drag this down and the animation will start from the bottom. Or you can drag it up and the animation will start from the top. Now, how can we sort these clones? You can see that in this case, this bottom row is created first, then the row above it starts, and then the next row on the bottom level is animated on. And I want to change that too. And we can do that on the Sort tab of the NOTA Effector. And I haven't mentioned it before, there is a free trial version of the NOTA Effector, but it doesn't have a lot of the options that the full version does, and one of them is the Sort option. And like with the start reference, you can add a null object that you can use to control the sorting of the clones, or you can drag any object in there that you want. I'm just going to add a null object, and it's going to be called Sort, and it's going to be created right at the center, just like the start object. So if I go back and start the animation, you can now see that, well, you can't really see it here. Let's just reduce the count to 3 on the x-axis maybe. So you can see the clones at the center are the first ones to reach their final position. And I can take that sorting null object and move it over, for example, and now our clones are animating on from the left to the right. And if I want to animate these on, I'll just go to the matrix object. I'll also add more clones on the y-axis, and let's say I want the clones at the bottom to be the first ones to be animated on. I would just move the sort null object down there, and if I move this over a bit, now depending on where you put that sort null object, you will get a different animation. Now this is exactly what I want in this case. I want the bottom clones to be animated on first, then the next row, and then the row above it. So that's how we can control where the animation starts and the order in which the clones are animated on. And that's the basics of the NOTA Effector. One tab that is also very useful is the Random tab. You can add a random offset regarding the position. You can add random rotation or random scale. So let's add some rotation on the y-axis, and you can see now these clones are also rotating as they animate on. Let's just move that start effector a little bit closer to maybe here. So now these are also rotating. I'll just move this up a little bit further. So anyway, that is the basics that you need to know to be able to work with the NOTA Effector. And on the Effector tab, you can also change the position, rotation, and scale curves. By default, scale is set to 0, so the clones are not scaled down at the beginning of the animation, but I can do that if I just drag this point down. Everything disappears, and now the clones get bigger as they are animated on. So now that we know how the NOTA Effector works, let's use that knowledge to animate our cube pieces here, or our Tetris-shaped pieces. And for this animation, what I did was I set the duration time to 17 and the steps to 2.5. And depending on these settings, you'll also have to change the timeline, or the time on the timeline, because depending on these settings, it will take the clones longer to animate on. And you can see 90 frames will not be enough to finish the animation here. So let's go back to the first frame. One thing I want to do is I want to bring the scale down, and I want these to stay small for a longer time. So I'm just going to change that curve to something like this. So now we're getting this. And I want this animation to start from the top, so I'm going to add a start null object, and I'm going to move this up to about, let's do 500. And let's see how that looks. And that's basically fine. We need to change the timeline here to something longer. Let's try 180 frames. So that's fine, but I also want to sort these clones, and I want to start the animation from the bottom. So I want these pieces to build up this cube from the bottom. So what I'll do is I'll add a sort null object, and we have to play around with the precision a little bit. So I'm going to put this somewhere below here, and let's see how our clones animate on. And I'm going to put this to about here. So now we're starting at this front right corner. We're building the bottom pieces first, and then everything else is animated on until the cube is finished. And now we're almost done. What I'm going to do to add a little more interest is I'm going to the random tab of the NOTA Effector, and I'll just change the random rotation to 180 on all the axes. And the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make this animation a little bit smoother by selecting the Voronoi object, and I'm going to add a delay effector. And that is the final animation. We can now go to the render settings, set the output to all frames, change the resolution to 1920 by 1080, and render the animation. And you should get something like I showed you at the beginning of the tutorial. So thanks for watching this tutorial. I hope you've enjoyed it. Take care everyone, and I'll see you again soon.